They said it was for my safety, then drove away without looking back. That's the sentence that echoes in my head when I close my eyes at night, when I stand at the sink, rinsing out a chipped teacup, when I hear a car door slam 2 houses down. It wasn't the words themselves, really. People say things all the time. It was the way they didn't wait for an answer, the way my daughter smoothed her blouse and wouldn't meet my eyes, how my son-in-law glanced at his watch like he was already late for something else. It's just for a little while, Mom. You need to rest. We all do. I stood there, purse dangling from my wrist, the same wrist that once hoisted their school bags, held their fevers, steadied their toddler steps. And now it trembled ever so slightly, not from age or weakness, but from the weight of realization. I wasn't being helped. I was being placed. I am 81. I live alone now. Truly alone, not in the euphemism people use when someone's just lost their spouse, but in the kind that hums in the silence of early mornings and buzzes in your ears when the fridge clicks off. But it wasn't always like this. I raised 2 children, survived 1 husband, buried 2 sisters, paid off a mortgage, and once nursed a neighbor through chemo without being asked. I taught Sunday school for 23 years. I brought pies to bake sales even when the oven door broke. I was dependable. I was the phone call at 11 p.m. when the sitter canceled. I was the extra place at the table, the emergency contact, the one who remembered birthdays when others forgot. But what I wasn't, not then, not yet, was dispensable. That came later. The day they left me at the nursing home was warm, absurdly so for late October. I remember the sunlight coming through the tinted windows of the car, how it made the dust on the dashboard shimmer like something holy. I'd packed an overnight bag. They told me it was just until they could make the house safer, maybe get a chairlift installed. My daughter had printed out pamphlets, circled the phrases independent living and luxury amenities in yellow highlighter. It wasn't until we pulled into the long gravel drive and I saw the peeling gold letters on the sign, River Pines Residential Facility, that something shifted in my gut. But I smiled. I always smiled. I said thank you to the intake nurse. I signed the clipboard. I even complimented the decor. Pale blue wallpaper with cranes in flight, a motif that tried too hard not to offend. You'll be comfortable here, the nurse said, as if comfort were the same thing as consent. My room was small but clean. Twin bed, a laminated dresser, and a window that looked out onto the rear parking lot. The view didn't matter. What mattered was the silence that followed after the door clicked shut. They said they'd come back the next day with more of my things, photos, my knitting bag, the book I was halfway through. They didn't. The phone calls stopped before the second week. My granddaughter texted once, a photo of her Halloween costume with no caption. I replied with a pumpkin emoji. She didn't answer. After a month, I stopped checking. The staff weren't cruel. They were polite in the way people are when they don't want to get sued. Medication on time, 3 meals a day, weekly activities on a corkboard in the common room. But no one really saw me. They spoke in cheerful tones meant for infants or tourists. One nurse called me Sweetie so often I forgot she knew my name. I was one of the lucky ones, I suppose. I still had all my teeth and most of my wits. I wasn't incontinent. I could carry on a conversation about current events, even if I did forget which day it was sometimes. But there was something about that place. The way time folded in on itself, the way everyone smelled faintly of antiseptic and vanilla lotion, that made the hours feel like layers of gauze being wrapped tighter and tighter around who I used to be. I remember one afternoon, maybe 3 weeks in, when I sat in the sunroom reading the same page of a book over and over, not because I couldn't follow the plot, but because I couldn't find a reason to turn the page. A woman named Eunice sat beside me, muttering to herself about her lost wedding ring. She wasn't wearing any jewelry. I don't think she ever had, but her fingers kept curling inward like they were looking for something to grasp. That was when it hit me. This place wasn't just a way station. It was a forgetting factory. You came in with a story, and slowly, sentence by sentence, it was erased. Not maliciously, just efficiently. I had a fall, you see. Just a small one. Slipped on the kitchen mat while reaching for the kettle. I didn't break anything, just bruised pride and some color on my hip. But that was all the excuse they needed. My daughter showed up the next morning with worry in her voice and a clipboard in her hand. "Mom, you scared us," she said. "We need to know you're safe." Not, "How are you feeling?" Not, "What do you want?" Just this bland, blank concern, the kind that sounds like love but feels like strategy. At first, I believed her. I even defended them to the other residents when they asked if my family visited. "Oh, they're just busy," I'd say. "They'll come soon." But the weeks stretched like taffy, and eventually, even I stopped trying to explain away the silence. When the facility chaplain asked if I wanted to talk, I said no. What I wanted was not to be someone people talked to, but someone people talked with. There's a difference, you know, a difference they stopped noticing. So I began keeping a little notebook. Nothing dramatic, just a list of things I wanted to remember in case no one else did. My husband's laugh when the toast burned, the smell of honeysuckle on the walk to church, the exact weight of my granddaughter when she was born. 6 pounds, 2 ounces, and a future so wide I could hardly look at her without crying. I wrote it all down in tiny, cramped letters with a ballpoint pen someone left behind at bingo. I wrote until the spine cracked and the ink dried, and still I wasn't finished. The turning point didn't come as a moment of rage or revelation. It came on a Tuesday, during macaroni casserole and stewed carrots. I overheard my daughter on the phone with the front desk, asking about visitation rules for non-immediate family. She wasn't calling for herself. She was asking if her teenage son could visit, if it was even worth the hassle. "She's doing fine, right?" she asked. "I mean, she's not really expecting us?" That was when something went very quiet inside me. Not broken. Broken is too loud. Just still. A stillness that felt like the center of a storm. And in that stillness, a decision began to grow. Not fast, not angry, but real. It took me another month to act on it, to wait for the moment, to hide the right items in the right places, to gather what little I had left. A few dollars tucked into the hem of an old sweater. A phone number scribbled on the back of a crossword page. And the name of someone I hadn't spoken to in decades, but who, if memory served, had never asked me to be anything but myself. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This story doesn't begin when I left the nursing home. It begins when I understood that no one was coming to get me, that the people who claimed to love me had placed me in a waiting room and thrown away the number. And once you understand that, truly understand it, there's only one thing left to do. You stop waiting. You stand up. And you walk out. The day it became undeniable wasn't marked by a fight or an outburst or some catastrophic mistake on my part. It wasn't dramatic. That's what made it so cruel, the sheer ordinariness of it. It was a Thursday, bland as oatmeal. I'd spent the morning in the recreation room watching a documentary about national parks with a few other residents, none of whom spoke much. I didn't mind the silence. I'd learned to live alongside it the way you live alongside a creek, always there, but just out of reach. After lunch, I returned to my room and found the envelope. It was small, white, unassuming. No return address. Just my name in black ink, printed by hand, too neat to be from either of my children. I opened it slowly, careful not to tear the corners. Inside was a single sheet of paper from the facility's administrative office. It stated, in polite bureaucratic language, that as of that week, all personal banking notifications would be redirected to my daughter's address. The phrase used was, "for administrative convenience." That phrase, 4 words, was what cracked something in me. Not the logistics, not the policy, but the tone. Administrative convenience. As if I were a task to be managed, as if the rhythms of my life, bills, statements, small acts of autonomy, were just clutter to be streamlined. I called the front desk. The young woman who answered had a soft, tired voice and seemed surprised I was even aware. "Oh, yes," she said, flipping through something. "That was updated by your next of kin. It's standard when the family assumes responsibility for care." Assumes responsibility? It sounded noble, didn't it? But what it meant was control. What it meant was that I wasn't trusted to navigate my own affairs. What it meant was that I had been quietly, efficiently, legally erased. That night, I sat in my room and stared at the curtain rod above the window, watching the shadows move across the plaster wall as the security light from the parking lot shifted with the wind. I couldn't sleep. I didn't even try. Around, that's what it felt like. Not a theft of money or time or even dignity. A theft of selfhood. My bank was mine. My mail was mine. My life, whatever scraps remained of it, was mine. And now it was a shared asset, a case file, a box checked on someone else's to-do list. I was no longer a person. I was a point of liability. 2 days later, I received another envelope. This one was from a lawyer, my daughter's. Inside was a copy of a proposed power of attorney agreement, already filled out, with my name typed neatly in the signature field. All I had to do was sign. No pressure, no explanation, just a note attached in my daughter's handwriting. "Mom, this will make things easier for everyone." Easier. That word again. Not kinder, not safer. Just easier. I folded the paper carefully and slid it back into the envelope without touching a pen. At lunch that day, Eunice, the woman who always muttered about her lost ring, looked up at me suddenly and said, "You're leaving soon." It wasn't a question. I didn't answer. I just smiled and reached for her napkin when she dropped it. But something in me nodded. Yes, I was. Not because I had a plan. Not yet. But because I could no longer stay. That night, I lay in bed and remembered the last real conversation I'd had with my daughter. It had been over a year earlier, before the fall, before the quiet reassignment of my life. She'd called me at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday to ask if I could watch the kids on Saturday, because their usual sitter had canceled. I said yes, of course I did. She didn't ask how I was, or if I was free, or if I had other plans. Just, "Can you take the kids?" And I did. I always did. I made lasagna and cleaned up their mess and pretended not to notice when the older one rolled her eyes at me. That was the last time I felt needed. Not wanted, not loved, just used in a way that still had purpose. Now they didn't even need me for that. Now I was a risk, a complication, a cost center. I could feel the edges of myself starting to fray in that place. Every day was a copy of the one before. Wake up. Medication. Breakfast. Wait. 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 A brief shuffle to the lounge. A tepid tray of lunch. A bingo sheet with missing numbers. Dinner. News no one listened to. Lights out. Repeat. The staff were kind enough, but kindness without intimacy is a cold blanket. They called me Mrs. Harlow, as if formality were a kindness, as if my first name had been archived for safekeeping. No one asked about my garden. No one remembered I used to teach. No one mentioned the poems I once wrote or the volunteer hours I gave to the shelter down on 8th and Monroe. I was reduced to a set of stats: age, blood pressure, allergy status. I became the quiet one in room 214 with the stubborn blood sugar and the good insurance. Then came the day I asked to see the director. I said I wanted to review my records, understand my status. She looked puzzled, even concerned. "Are you unhappy here?" she asked. I said I wasn't anything here. That's what scared me most. She offered to call my daughter. I declined. Instead, I asked for a printout of my billing records. She hesitated, but eventually obliged. What I saw made my stomach tighten. Charges for services I hadn't used. A recurring payment to an account listed under my daughter's LLC. I stared at the line item for private transportation services, even though I hadn't left the facility in 3 months. I said nothing to the director, just nodded and said thank you. But I walked back to my room differently. Slower, yes, but with a clarity that felt almost electric. That night, I made my decision. It was not born of anger, though I had plenty. It was not born of fear, though I was afraid. It was born of something older, something bone deep. The same thing that made me leave home at 17. The same thing that carried me through my husband's cancer. The same thing that taught me how to survive on a nurse's salary with 2 children and 1 broken car. I didn't have a name for it then. I still don't. But I know what it feels like. It feels like remembering yourself, like hearing your own voice after years of silence and thinking, "Oh, there you are." I wasn't running away. I was reclaiming something that should never have been given away in the first place. The right to be a person, a full, flawed, living woman. Not a file, not a patient, not a burden passed between inboxes. The next morning, I tucked the lawyer's envelope under my mattress, where I'd hidden the $200 I'd been saving for emergencies. I considered this one, and so, the day my name was quietly removed from my own mailbox, the day my daughter's voice began answering questions meant for me, the day a stranger in an office somewhere decided what pills I needed and what television channel I would fall asleep. 2. That was the day I knew I was no longer invited to my own life. I had been left behind long before I ever stood up to leave, and I wasn't going to wait for a better moment. The moment was already here. I didn't leave immediately. People always imagine it as some grand departure, a dramatic escape into the unknown. A suitcase snapped shut, a door slammed, footsteps echoing in a hallway. But it didn't happen like that. It began with a series of tiny subtractions, a slow erosion. I started to feel as if pieces of me were being unhooked in silence, one by one, like ornaments taken down after a long-forgotten holiday. First went my knitting needles. I'd asked about them after my 3rd week in the facility, wondering aloud whether anyone had found the canvas bag I'd packed, the one with the soft gray wool the half-finished shawl I'd been working on for my granddaughter. The nurse checked the storage room, or so she said, but came back with only a folded blanket that wasn't mine and a puzzled frown. "It may have been misplaced in the transfer," she offered, as if misplaced could explain how something handmade, something touched by me daily, simply vanished. Then my books began to disappear. I'd brought a volume of Mary Oliver's poems, a battered copy of Little Women with my name written inside the front cover in the cursive I used to teach my students, and a small anthology of love letters from the 1940s I found in a thrift shop once and never could part with. One morning, I came back from breakfast and found only one book on the shelf, a facility-issued devotional with the words "Bright Days Ahead" printed across the cover in pale blue script. No one knew what happened to the others. "Maybe they were taken by mistake," the orderly said. Mistake! The word echoed around my brain until it started to lose meaning. Were my things being taken? Or was I simply being rubbed out, slowly, like chalk, from a sidewalk before the rain? Every day I noticed new absences. A pair of earrings I wore only on Sundays. A photograph of my late husband from our 40th anniversary trip to Sedona. The one where we stood in front of red rocks with the wind in our hair, the sun in our squinting eyes. Gone. Replaced by a bland watercolor of flowers that had no name. No one took responsibility. No one even seemed particularly concerned. "It's probably just somewhere safe," the nurse said once, as though safety could be found in the empty drawer where I once kept my past. I began to mark the changes, not with complaint. I knew better than to complain. Complaints were cataloged, monitored, evaluated. Complaints meant someone came into your room with a clipboard and a furrowed brow and asked whether you were adjusting. No, I marked them in silence, each loss tallied internally like a mourner at a wake. My sweater, the blue one with the elbow patches I wore on cold mornings, was replaced with a thinner one that smelled like starch. My tea bags, the kind I liked from the Polish grocer downtown, were confiscated for health reasons. My radio, a gift from my students when I retired, stopped working mysteriously one night and was taken away for repairs. It never returned. Conversations became another casualty. At first, people talked to me like I mattered. Briefly, politely, but with enough eye contact to feel real. But as the weeks wore on, that changed. They began talking about me instead of to me. "She's a quiet one," I overheard a nurse say near the door. "Doesn't cause trouble." I wanted to shout. I taught for 32 years. I raised 2 children. I had a garden full of lavender and basil and fought City Hall over the sidewalk ordinance. But what came out instead was a faint smile, the kind that signals compliance, the kind that makes you invisible. The facility had a calendar of events, trivia night, chair yoga, crafts. I stopped going. Not because I thought I was above them, but because each gathering felt like a rehearsal for extinction. The same faces, the same scripted pleasantries, the same reminders of what we'd already lost. One afternoon, during a watercolor session, I was handed a brush and told to paint what home feels like. I froze. Not because I didn't know, but because I did. Home wasn't a place. It was a feeling. It was the sound of the kettle whistling while Derek whistled with it. It was the scent of apple pie crust cooling on a windowsill too old for double glazing. It was mismatched chairs at the dining table and a drawer full of junk no one ever cleaned. I couldn't paint that. So I dipped the brush in water, let it sit on the paper, and told the facilitator I was tired. Time, too, began to unravel. Days no longer had texture. Monday was no different from Friday. I measured time by the way the light hit the floor in the afternoons, the slow turn of seasons in the trees beyond the fence, the frequency of reruns on the common room television. No one celebrated my birthday. It came and went like a shadow at dusk. I didn't even mention it. I wasn't interested in the kind of celebration that came from obligation. If someone had remembered on their own, that would have been different. But they didn't. So I pretended not to notice. Meals became my only real anchor, and even those started to feel distant. I used to cook. Real food. Food that crackled and hissed and needed stirring and seasoning and time. Here, meals arrived on trays, warm but never hot, organized in plastic compartments like offerings in some sanitized ritual. Once, during a lunch of over-steamed green beans and turkey loaf, I asked the KitchenAid whether it would be possible to get something spicier. She looked at me as if I'd spoken another language. "This is a cardiac-friendly menu," she said. I nodded and chewed and swallowed and stopped asking. Letters, too, began to disappear. I wrote to my granddaughter every week, long letters, full of small stories and folded with care. I never received a reply. When I asked the front desk whether there'd been any mail for me, they shrugged. "Mail sometimes gets delayed," they said. I started to wonder whether the letters were ever sent, whether the stamps I affixed with careful fingers made it past the front desk, whether anyone had read my words or whether they sat in a drawer somewhere, their paper curling with time and inattention. I suppose the real breaking point came one morning when I found my closet rearranged. My clothes, the ones I'd packed myself, chosen for comfort and familiarity, had been replaced. Not removed exactly, but pushed aside, hidden behind a row of new garments. Soft pastel blouses, elastic waist pants in beige and cream, a cardigan with a name tag sewn in. Institutional clothing. They hadn't thrown anything away. They hadn't needed to. They simply covered me with something more manageable. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, with my feet in my slippers and my hands folded in my lap. I tried to remember the last time I'd touched something that belonged to me. Really belonged. Not issued, not approved, not replaced. Something mine. I couldn't. I looked around the room and realized that nothing in it had come from my life. Even the bedspread was new, unfamiliar. It smelled like bleach and unfamiliar fabric softener. I was a guest in a place meant to be home, and I hadn't been asked how I felt about any of it. I turned off the light and lay in bed, eyes wide open in the dark. A nurse walked by, her shoes squeaking on the linoleum, her shadow long and narrow under the door. I wondered whether she knew that just beyond the door lay someone who once marched in protest in '72, who once planted 50 tulips in a single afternoon, who once read Jane Eyre aloud to a room full of fifth graders until they wept at the ending. Probably not. Probably she only knew that I took my pills without complaint and didn't ask for seconds. I realized then that I was being erased not out of malice, but out of design. This place wasn't meant for remembering. It was meant for quiet compliance, for slow unwinding, for ending with as little mess as possible. But I wasn't ready to end. Not yet. The shift didn't announce itself. It didn't come with an outburst or a revelation. No one handed me a mirror and said, "Look what you've become." That's not how clarity works. At least not when you're 81 and accustomed to waiting. It comes quietly at first. It seeps in through cracks you've spent years pretending didn't exist. For me, It arrived in the form of a young man named Leo who worked the overnight shift at the nursing home 3 nights a week. He couldn't have been more than 25. Skinny, polite, with a soft spot for Sudoku and a shy way of asking how you were, like he wasn't sure you'd answer. It started with a conversation about books. I was sitting in the small library nook one night because I couldn't sleep again. The hum of the building always grew louder at night, like it was remembering things it wished it hadn't seen. I found a collection of outdated magazines and one broken-spined mystery novel, and was flipping through the pages more for the motion than the story when Leo walked by with a cart of linens. "Anything good?" he asked. I told him not really, and that led to a 30-minute chat about what we both used to read. He liked sci-fi. I said I didn't understand it, but I admired its loyalty to imagined futures. That made him smile, and he asked me what I liked. I told him poetry, and his eyebrows lifted slightly. "Like rhyming poetry?" he asked. "No," I said. "Like truth wrapped in stillness." He looked at me like he'd never heard someone talk like that before, and maybe he hadn't. Or maybe he just hadn't heard anyone that old say anything other than, "Where's my walker?" Or, "Is it time for pills yet?" The next week he brought me a book, a slim, worn volume of Rainer Maria Rilke, translated into English. I don't know where he got it. Probably a used shop, maybe his own shelf. Inside the cover was a sticky note that said, "Thought this might feel like a window." That was the moment I knew I could trust him. Not with everything, but with something. Enough. So I asked him one night, when the halls were quiet and the others were sleeping, whether he could help me look something up online. "Just an address," I said. He hesitated, probably weighing the risk, the policy, the ethics of doing something even slightly off script. But then he nodded. He wheeled the cart to the end of the hall, pulled out his phone, and handed it to me like it was a sacred object. I typed slowly. The name of a bank I used to use before my daughter transferred everything to a more streamlined system. To my surprise, the login still worked. She hadn't changed the password. She'd just stopped reminding me it existed. The balance wasn't large, but it was enough. Enough for a bus ticket, a few nights somewhere, a start. After that, I began preparing. Quietly, intentionally. Not like a runaway, more like a woman opening her own front door after years of watching someone else hold the key. I gathered my things. What few were left. A sweater I'd managed to keep hidden in a laundry bag, the notebook where I'd been writing down memories, the Rilke book from Leo. I began saving parts of my meals, packets of crackers, wrapped apples, things that wouldn't spoil. I rolled up socks and tucked a $10 bill into each one, the way my mother used to when we traveled by bus across state lines and worried about pickpockets. I didn't have a plan, not exactly. But I had a direction, a city I remembered from decades ago, a phone number scribbled in the back of my address book under the name M.K., which I recalled only as Mary Kessler, the woman who once taught painting next to my poetry workshop at the community college. I hadn't spoken to her in 30 years. I didn't even know if she still lived there. But I remembered her saying once, "If you ever need to disappear, come to my side of town. It's where people go to become who they were always meant to be." At the time, I thought it was something she'd read on a bumper sticker. But now it sounded like instruction. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of rain ticking gently against the window. I sat up, pulled on my shoes, and took the little bag I'd packed in secret. I didn't leave that night. I wasn't quite ready. But I walked down to the vending machines, watched the numbers light up behind the glass, and thought about how many times I'd told myself, "Just wait." Wait for someone to call. Wait for someone to visit. Wait for the situation to improve. Wait for the people who put you here to remember why they loved you in the first place. But waiting is its own kind of erasure. You wait long enough, you start to believe it's your only choice. Leo found me there an hour later, still holding a granola bar I hadn't eaten. He sat beside me on the bench, said nothing for a few minutes, then asked, "You're not really just reading poetry these days, are you?" I smiled. "No," I said. "I'm rehearsing." He didn't press. Instead, he handed me a folded piece of paper. A bus schedule with a red circle around the 9:20 a.m. line headed west. "You didn't get this from me," he said. "Of course not," I replied. I tucked the paper into my sock. After that, everything slowed down. Not in dread, but in the way a good plan moves, like honey poured into a cup of tea. I walked differently, straighter. I stopped going to the activity sessions. I declined bingo. I folded my clothes with care each night, choosing which blouse I'd wear when the moment came. I didn't rush. I wasn't afraid. If anything, I felt more myself than I had in years, like my spine remembered what standing was for. Like my voice, though mostly unused, could still sing if asked. Then came the day. It was unremarkable. The sky a flat gray, the breakfast overcooked eggs, the morning nurse quiet and rushed. But I felt it. The rightness of it. I tucked my bag beneath my cardigan. I waited until the shift change, when the staff was most distracted. I walked out the side door like someone going to the garden. And I didn't come back. At the bus station, I used cash. I didn't use my real last name. I kept my head down. No one looked twice. I sat in the back and watched the town shrink in the window, watched the trees blur and the world get larger with every mile. I didn't know what I'd find when I got where I was going, but I knew this. I had chosen it, with every step, with every breath. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. It didn't take long for them to realize I was gone, though I doubt they noticed right away. I imagine there was a moment of confusion when someone at the facility checked the bed during rounds and found the sheets neatly folded, the room empty, the closet half bare. Perhaps there was a brief staff meeting, hushed voices, questions about protocols and whether security footage should be reviewed. But what I know for certain is that no one called the police. No one filed a missing person report. They called my daughter. And my daughter, from wherever she sat, most likely her home office, surrounded by her sterile decor and perfectly arranged plants, didn't panic. Not at first. I believe she said something like, "She'll come back. She just wants attention." That's how it always begins when someone goes missing, not by accident, but by choice. People around them assume it's a phase, a whim, a tantrum dressed up in adult clothing. It takes time for fear to replace arrogance. And by the time it does, the person who left is long gone. I wasn't hiding. I was rebuilding. And I had no intention of letting their delayed worry reshape my path. The first weeks were quiet, almost dreamlike. I stayed in a small rented room above a secondhand bookstore, the kind of place that still smelled of paper and pipe smoke, even though no one smoked anymore. The woman who owned it was in her 70s herself, and when I asked her if she had any vacancies, she didn't question why I had no references, no recent address, no family to call. My room had a slanted ceiling and a view of a brick wall, but I didn't care. The bed was mine. The silence was mine. Every morning, I opened the window and breathed in the city's uncertain air. I didn't miss the nursing home. I didn't miss my children. I missed only my old self, the version of me that moved through the world without apology. I began walking, not with purpose at first, but just to feel the ground beneath my feet. I walked to the park. I drank bad coffee, ate good pie, and watched people come and go with their lives folded neatly into bags and strollers and phone calls. It was strange to be invisible in a place where no one expected me to disappear. I wasn't elderly here. I was just someone passing through. It felt like forgiveness. Then, slowly, the past began to reach toward me again, not with affection, but with a kind of grasping uncertainty, like a hand groping in the dark for a light switch. The first sign was a voicemail. I had turned the phone on only once since I'd left, just to check the balance on my prepaid plan. I hadn't planned to listen to messages, but I saw the number, my grandson Kieran's, and something in me softened. I played it. His voice cracked at the beginning. "Grandma," he said, "I don't know what happened, but I miss you. Mom and Dad are freaking out, but I wanted to say I love you." No accusations, no pressure, just those words. I love you. I didn't respond. Not yet. But I saved the message. Played it twice more, then turned the phone off again. A week later, I found a letter slipped under the door of the bookstore. No envelope. Just "We're willing to discuss your return, but we need to know you're safe." I read it 3 times. Not once did she say she was sorry. Not once did she acknowledge the months of silence before I left, the choices made on my behalf without consent, the way she and her husband quietly harvested pieces of my life until there was nothing left for me to hold on to. It was as if I had simply wandered off and disrupted their convenience. After that, the gestures became more aggressive. A man in a suit showed up at the bookstore one morning asking to speak with me. The owner told him I wasn't available, which was true. I had walked to the bakery that morning, looking for cardamom buns and solitude. When she told me about him later, she said he didn't seem angry, just persistent. I knew what he wanted. Not my company, not my health, my signature. I was still legally connected to a small property, one I'd helped my daughter purchase years ago when she and her husband were struggling with their first mortgage. I'd paid the down payment. My name had never been removed. That property had value now. It wasn't love they were chasing. It was leverage. Then came the article. I found it taped to the inside of the bookstore window one morning, probably left by someone from the neighborhood who had seen the paper. The headline read, "Beloved Grandmother Missing, Family Pleads for Answers." There was a photo of me, taken years ago, holding a tray of cookies at my granddaughter's 3rd birthday. My smile looked forced even then. The article was full of quotes from my daughter and son-in-law, statements about their concern, their confusion, their desperate hope that she returns safely. I stood on the sidewalk and laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. They weren't searching for me. They were covering their tracks. Inside the bookstore, the owner raised an eyebrow when I brought in the clipping. "You gonna let them twist your story?" she asked. I told her I didn't care what story they told, as long as I got to write mine. She nodded and said, "Good. Just don't let them write the ending." But endings have a way of circling close, even when you don't invite them. One afternoon I saw her, my daughter, standing across the street, dressed in a sleek coat, her hair pinned up the way she always did for client meetings. She wasn't alone. Her husband was there too, though he stayed in the car. She didn't cross. She didn't shout. She just stared at the bookstore for a long time, then turned and walked away. I waited a full minute before going outside. She was gone, but I felt her presence like a chill. She wasn't there to apologize. She was there to reclaim. That night, I turned the phone on again. Dozens of missed calls, a few voicemails. One from my son-in-law, clipped and impatient. "This is ridiculous, Martha. We're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to help. But you're making it impossible." Another from my daughter, quieter. "We just want you home. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." They still didn't understand. I wasn't lost. I was found, and I didn't want to come back to a place that had forgotten how to see me. But Kieran, he was different. His messages were spaced out, gentle, like someone knocking lightly on a closed door, not to break it down, but to let you know they were still there. "I'm working at a bookstore now," he said in one voicemail. "I think you'd like it. Smells like cedar and dust. I keep wondering if you're somewhere like this." I smiled at that. He knew me better than either of his parents ever had. When I finally texted him a one-line reply, "I'm safe," he didn't bombard me with questions. He just wrote, "I'm glad. I miss you." It was enough. But the pressure from the rest of the family didn't stop. The lawyer returned, this time with documents. He found me sitting on the back step of the bookstore, sipping tea. He was polite, professional, and completely indifferent to anything but the paperwork in his folder. "We're hoping you'll consider signing over the property," he said. "There are financial concerns, uncertainties." I told him the only uncertainty was whether I'd press charges for harassment. That seemed to rattle him. He left, muttering something about intentions and goodwill. I tore the envelope in half and dropped it in the trash. That night, I wrote a letter. Not to my daughter, not to her husband, to Kieran. I told him the truth. Not all of it, but enough. That I had been erased, and I had chosen to reappear on my own terms. That I wasn't angry, but I was done being managed. That he was the only one who had reached out without expectation. I told him he could visit if he came alone. I mailed the letter with a stamp I'd saved, one with a small gold finch on it, the kind of bird that sings even when it's cold. When I went to bed that night, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. There's a difference. Triumph is loud. Settlement is quiet. Like soil pressed around the base of something newly planted. You don't see the roots yet, but you know they're there, and they're yours. I didn't know what I would feel when I saw him walk into the bookstore that afternoon, not until I looked up from the register and saw his figure pause at the doorway, hesitant and wide-eyed, carrying nothing but a canvas backpack slung over one shoulder and a paperback sticking out of the front pocket. Kieran, my grandson. Taller than I remembered, with a face that still had the softness of boyhood around the mouth, but eyes that had seen too much too early, probably because of all the silence his parents mistook for normal. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me like I was a story he'd been trying to retell but could never quite finish. I nodded toward the back table without a word, and he followed me there, the hush of his sneakers on the old floorboards sounding more like reverence than hesitation. We sat for a long time without speaking, and when he finally did speak, it wasn't with demands or explanations or apologies he didn't owe. He said simply, "I brought the letters." And he placed a small bundle of folded papers on the table, each one creased and smudged, but still intact, each one in my handwriting. I reached out and touched them like you touch something holy, like they might disappear if you blinked. He said he'd found them a few weeks ago, tucked in a drawer in the hallway cabinet back home, underneath an old stack of tax forms and unopened envelopes. "They said you stopped writing," he said quietly. "Said you were confused." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The letters were answer enough. They were the proof that I had tried, that I had reached out over and over, and that somewhere between the reaching and the receiving, someone else had chosen to intercept. I knew then what I had to do, not for revenge, not to punish. I didn't believe in punishing people who were already prisoners of their own cowardice. But I believed in truth, in putting things back where they belonged. And I knew now that there would never be peace for me, not real peace, until the final tie was severed. Not out of bitterness, but clarity. Because I had spent too long being half-owned, half-remembered, half-allowed. I couldn't be split any longer. That night, I took out the folder I had kept hidden in the bottom of the dresser drawer in my rented room. It held everything: copies of deeds, legal notices, bank statements, letters from lawyers, all the paper ghosts of a life that others had tried to manage. I laid them out on the table like puzzle pieces and stared at them until the language stopped feeling like threat and began to feel like blueprint. I called a woman named Delia the next morning. She was a lawyer whose name I'd been given months ago by the bookstore owner. In case things got messy, she'd said. Delia was blunt, efficient, and sharp in a way that made you feel instantly protected. I told her everything. I showed her the documents. I gave her power of attorney, but this time it was mine to give. And I gave it to someone whose job was to protect me, not manage me. We filed paperwork. We sent notices. We made decisions. My name was removed from the house. My accounts were restructured. The old will was shredded and a new one drafted, this time with clear lines, sharp edges, and a single heir, Kieran. Not because I loved him more, but because he saw me when no one else did. A week later, I received a call from my daughter. I didn't answer, but I listened to the message. Her voice trembled, not with sorrow, but with disbelief, like someone who's just realized that a door they've always expected to be unlocked has been bolted from the inside. "I don't understand," she said. "Why would you do this? We were just trying to help. You've put us in a terrible position." That phrase, "you've put us," clanged in my chest like a dropped pan. It had always been about them, their comfort, their reputation, their version of the truth. I deleted the message. Then came the letter, this time from her husband, legalistic, cold, demanding a meeting to discuss the terms of the property transfer and to clarify intentions regarding estate disbursement. I took the letter, walked to the fireplace in the back room of the bookstore, and fed it to the flames. I didn't need to clarify anything. My life was not a negotiation. It never should have been. That weekend, Delia filed the final documents. It was done. Irrevocable. I had cut the last cord that connected me to a system of care that had cared only about compliance. The next morning, I woke up before dawn and walked out to the little patch of garden behind the bookstore. There, beneath the overgrown vines and cracked flagstone, I planted a row of bulbs, tulips, lavender, crocus, using my bare hands. No gloves, just earth and skin. It was the first time in years I'd planted anything without supervision, without being told not to strain my back or wear my coat or mind the cold. My fingers were stiff, but they remembered. They remembered the rhythm of rebirth. Kieran joined me later, bringing coffee and silence. We sat on the bench, watching the morning light slide down the bricks, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like someone who had escaped. I felt like someone who had arrived. I told him the story, everything. Not just what they'd done, but what I'd allowed. The years of silence, the choices I didn't challenge, the comfort I mistook for safety. He didn't interrupt. He listened the way people listen when they know the telling costs you something. And when I was finished, he took my hand and said, "You didn't disappear. You came home." That evening, I wrote one last letter to my daughter. Not to mend things, not to explain, just to say, I'm not angry, I'm not broken, but I'm not coming back. I didn't mail it. I folded it into a book of poetry and shelved it at the bookstore under M. Let someone else find it one day. Let them know that a woman once lived who chose the quiet over the cruel, the truth over the convenient, the self over the role she'd been assigned, that she had been erased and then, gloriously, wrote herself back in. There is a particular kind of silence that comes not from absence, but from fullness. A silence that doesn't demand to be filled, that doesn't ache or echo or press. It simply sits with you, like an old friend who no longer needs to talk to feel understood. That's the silence I live with now. It comes in the mornings, when the light spills across the wooden floor of my small room above the bookstore, warming the cracked windowsill where I keep the sprig of lavender I replanted last spring. It comes in the afternoons, when the city hums just beyond reach, and I sit by the open window with a cup of tea and reread the letters I once thought were lost forever. It comes in the evenings, when the shops close, the traffic fades, and I hear only the soft creak of the building settling into itself, as if it, too, has stopped running from its age. I live in this silence like I once lived in noise, invisible but aware, peripheral but alert. Only now, the alertness is not for danger, but for beauty. I notice things I never used to. The rhythm of rain on the gutter, the way dust dances in a shaft of light, the slight shift in air when someone good enters a room. These are the gifts that come when no one is measuring your usefulness. Sometimes, people come into the bookstore looking for something they can't name. They browse the shelves without urgency, touching the spines of books like they might touch someone's arm at a funeral, not to grasp, but to feel that they are still warm. I don't sell them stories. I offer them doorways. And when I recommend a title, I don't do it to impress. I do it to say, this one healed me. Maybe it will sit with you too. There is a kind of magic in being able to give something without expectation. No one here expects me to perform, to sacrifice, to stay quiet so others can speak louder. I am no longer anyone's afterthought. I am the narrator of my own breath. Kieran visits on Sundays. He brings pastries from a shop I've grown fond of and tells me about his new job at the community center, how he's helping seniors with technology, how he's learning that most people don't want more apps. They just want to be heard. We don't talk about his mother anymore. Not out of bitterness, but out of understanding. Some wounds don't need to be reopened to be honored. He asked me once, very gently, if I thought she ever loved me. I told him love that requires obedience isn't love. It's fear dressed in sentiment. And I am no longer afraid. Sometimes I write. Not to publish, not to prove, but simply to remember myself on paper. I write about the girl I once was, the teacher I became, the woman who cooked every Sunday for people who forgot to say thank you. I write about my husband and the way he whistled when he washed dishes and how I still hear that tune in my sleep. I write about the moment I walked out of a place that had locked the door from the inside and how I learned that freedom isn't a gate flung open. It's a choice repeated, quietly, every day. I've made a will. It's short, clear. No one will have to guess what I meant. The bookstore will go to the owner's niece, who's already running the poetry section with more reverence than I ever managed. My remaining savings will go to Kieran, with a letter attached that reads, "Spend some, save some, give some away, but never give yourself away." I wrote that line with a steady hand, without trembling or doubt. I don't believe in happy endings. I believe in true ones. Mine is not tidy, not free of grief, not wrapped in ribbons of reconciliation. But it is mine, entirely. And in that, there is peace. Not the kind that settles in a rocking chair and waits to die, but the kind that stands barefoot in a garden and feels the earth pulse beneath it, and knows, finally, that she belongs. To any woman reading this, wondering if she is too late, too old, too entangled to begin again, hear me. It is never too late to return to yourself. And returning doesn't always look like revolution. Sometimes it looks like planting something. Sometimes it looks like saying no. Sometimes it looks like silence. But always it feels like home.